This is a TalkStation original podcast.
Let's talk about Fentanyl Victims Network of North Carolina. This is an organization, as I understand it, in Wake County. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. The Fentanyl Victims Network of North Carolina was formed a few years ago by a lady named Barbara Walsh, and she has now moved that forward to a statewide organization, and they are responsible for public safety, education, justice, and advocacy with regard to overdose death cases. Barb actually had a daughter who died as a result of a drug death, fentanyl poisoning, a few years ago in the western part of the state. And Barbara Walsh took this on as her mission, and she is an advocate for folks who have died and their families from fentanyl poisoning in our state. She works at the legislature to increase and toughen the laws, and she also works to hold law enforcement and prosecutors accountable for investigating and prosecuting these cases.
I'm looking at a document that actually I got last year, but I'm sure it's still current, and it's related to the success of the prosecution of fentanyl, addictive services, particularly fentanyl. We've talked about this on numerous occasions, Asa. As a matter of fact, maybe I'm going to say roughly 12 years ago. It seems just like yesterday. You and I were doing a weekly show. At that time, it was on opioids in general, predominantly prescription drug abuse. But the issue of fentanyl has really taken off, and you have been very aggressive in your capacity as sheriff in stopping it in Carteret County. As a matter of fact, you and District Attorney Scott Thomas had at one point, may still do, lead the state in the areas of prosecution and conviction of fentanyl distribution, but also deaths as a result of fentanyl. So let's talk about your purpose on this and your determination.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad that you got our district attorney, Scott Thomas, and I on at the same time, because, we came into office in the same year. Scott got a little bit of time on me. He came in the beginning of 2006. I came in at the end of 2006. And we've been working together on all criminal justice matters, including drug enforcement and all the issues that surround drug enforcement and drug addiction and the resulting crime and what have you. And back in those days, we were dealing tremendously on the prescription drug issue. And like you said, coming on your program and doing other things, any number of different public service announcements, public community forums and meetings, town halls, meeting with various groups, every opportunity we had for many years, just bringing awareness to the situation surrounding the addiction to all drugs, but especially prescription drugs at that time, and the need for treatment services and the like. And then, of course, as the prescription drug issue began to wane, and then the drug dealers started flooding all of our markets across our country with heroin, and then subsequent to that, fentanyl, which has tremendously increased the number of overdoses in general and the number of overdose deaths way beyond what we used to see with prescription drugs. And we've been working hand in hand, trying to resolve those issues. We've served together on task forces, including the Attorney General's task force on opioids, and lobbying and working with the legislature to create the death by distribution law, which we now have, and through our office, working and basically having to try to figure out how to investigate these cases, and working with the DA's office, figuring out how to prosecute these cases. I'm very happy to report that through all the work of our two offices working together and our tremendous staffs that we have, we lead the state in the investigation and prosecution of individuals for death by distribution. And that's what we received the award 2 Saturdays ago from Barb Walsh and the Fentanyl Victims Network, which goes to show that there's been a lot of hard work going into this effort for many years up to the present, and it's certainly been recognized.
Scott, I think there are times when, in your capacity as the district attorney, in order to prosecute the case, obviously the evidence has got to be, I'm going to use the word clean, it's got to be organized, the whole operation, because you're prosecuting the case before a judge and jury. Your hands are not involved in the actual investigation, but rather the presentation of the evidence and the investigation. So having the qualified staff, and we're going to get into this in a few minutes with you, Asa, but having the qualified staff that you can rely on, and I mean that particularly the investigative staff, that's probably a very important aspect. How much communication do you engage in with these law enforcement agencies? And I'm talking local police as well as the sheriff's office, but how do you go about dealing with that? Because the investigator is not necessarily at that moment thinking about how you have to present the case, because it could pivot on a thumbprint or just mishandled evidence, could it not?
Well, Lockwood, the key to our success in this district on prosecuting death by distribution is because we have a joint team effort. Okay. And I would say for two reasons. Number one, because Sheriff Buck and I have identified these cases as a priority for our offices. And number two is because we have excellent, competent, capable folks working in our offices. In Sheriff Buck's office, he has a primary investigator, and he can talk more about that, who primarily works on these cases along with some of his other investigators or detectives. And then in my office, I have Assistant District Attorney David Spence and his legal assistant, Michelle Gillikin, who actually handle the prosecution of these cases. And my office works closely with the sheriff's office on the front end during the course of these investigations. So the detectives from the sheriff's office or other law enforcement agencies in our district, they know what evidence is required and is needed, not only for probable cause for a charge, but for proof beyond reasonable doubt to prove the case in the court of law. But ADA, David Spence, and Michelle Gillikin do an outstanding job working with the folks in Sheriff Buck's office to work on these cases during the course of the investigation, and then once a charge is filed, to prepare a solid case for presentation in court.
We as the civilians are looking at this and we say, okay, great, they've got the culprit, they've got him cold. But you have to be very careful, do you not, in your presentation of these? I mean, am I correct on this? A case could pivot on a bad evidence or evidence that's mishandled, things of this nature?
Certainly, that's always the case. That's why it's important to have well-trained professionals with the sheriff's office and law enforcement agencies conducting these investigations, and also working closely with ADA Dave Spence in my office during the investigation and preparing these cases for trial. And I can tell you that in most of these cases, the cases are so solid and so well investigated that most of these cases result in a guilty plea and do not even require a trial.
Wow.
Occasionally we do have a trial, and we've been successful in those situations as well, based on the good quality work by the detectives and my ADA.
Asa, in your conversations and communications, and obviously you and I have talked one-on-one on this topic many times. I mean, good gosh, we go back to literally, now that I think about it, it was, I think, roughly 2011, maybe 2012, we were doing this weekly program, at that time, basically on opioid addiction. But it obviously is something that sits heavy on your heart, for want of a better description. Yeah. How do you get this across to your deputies, and not only the deputies, but in your communications with other law enforcement agents as well?
Well, just like District Attorney Thomas said, I mean, you have to make it a priority.
Okay.
Anything that's important to someone, you'll find a way to see it done and see it through. And, of course, I ran for sheriff to do something about drugs, nearly 20 years ago.
Right.
I'm in my 18th year in office. And, things in our business is dynamic and ever-changing. None of us ever saw the fentanyl crisis, back in those days, and it's something that evolved over time. And so we have to be able to evolve with those new things. It's just like technology and scams and all types of other things that we deal with presently. We have to see these things and how they are affecting our communities, and we have to work to keep up with them here locally and in our processes, investigative processes. And we have to work with the legislature to craft laws to try to deal with these issues. Something's not illegal unless the legislature says it is. And so when we're dealing with these new things, we have to work with the legislature. We do that through our Sheriff's Association, our District Attorneys Conference, of which Scott and I are leaders in both organizations. And we've been able to bring a lot of that knowledge and experience back with us here to help us to do our jobs in our offices respectively. But when I make something a priority in my office, then I make sure that my staff knows it's a priority and I stay on it. And I'm so proud of the work that they do every day in all facets, but especially in this regard as well. But here again, it's a team effort.
Right.
There's a lot of places across the state where these cases aren't investigated the way we do here, and some law enforcement agencies would like to prosecute them, but there's some prosecutorial districts where they don't prosecute things the way that we do here. So, one of us can't do anything without the other. Mm-hmm. And so, and to touch upon what Scott said a second ago, it's our detectives and ADAs have been working together for many years, and those who work here for a period of time and they gain that knowledge and experience and that working relationship with one another. I mean, we have tremendous trust amongst our folks, and we all know what the other expects. And so when my detectives go out and investigate a case, they know how the DAs, want to present the evidence, what needs to be done. And we basically work together hand in glove. It's really a good thing.
The success of and recognition for all the prosecutions that have been conducted on, fentanyl, but I'm going to be the broader aspect of drug abuse, and particularly the death by distribution charges. Is that an indication that Carteret County, your county, has a high level of drug activity, or what exactly is this an indication of?
I don't think it's certainly not an indication that Carteret County citizens use drugs more than folks in any other county. It's an indication that, like Scott said earlier, this is investigating these offenses is a priority in our office.
Okay.
And we investigate these offenses and we prosecute them, and we've been very successful. I think we're over 30 people that we've charged in Carteret County in the past few years, and like I said, we lead the state. Mm-hmm. Well, we lead the state because we've made it a priority to investigate and prosecute these offenders. It doesn't mean that there's more people using fentanyl or selling fentanyl in Carteret County than any other place. I've had people say to me before, they say, well, Sheriff, you got a lot of drugs in your county, don't you? And I'll ask them where they're from, and they'll say, well, Kinston or Greenville or wherever. I'm like, well, buddy, do you turn on the nightly news where you live? We don't have more drug dealers in Carteret County than to do other places. We just do a good job of busting them and letting the public know what we're doing.
In your conversations with other DAs across the state, what have they told you about their experiences in their various counties or districts? What's happening in North Carolina?
Well, I think they're seeing some of the same challenges and issues that we have here, and several have asked about our success and why we've been able to have these prosecutions and convictions in our district. And I've explained to them the close working relationship that we have with our three sheriffs in this district, mm-hmm. as well as the police chiefs and other law enforcement agencies. And really, you have so many competing demands on law enforcement and on prosecutors because there's so many different things going on that we have to deal with. But I've just simply explained that we made this a priority. And I think it's important to realize that not only have Sheriff Buck and myself made this a priority, but when the legislature passed some updates to the death by distribution law in 2023, I have some information here. When those updates were passed in 2023, they passed by a vote of 45-0 in the Senate and 81-20 in the House, which shows broad bipartisan support. And the governor at the time was Governor Cooper, and then he signed those revisions into law. So the legislature has also identified this as a priority, and they actually included in their legislative intent language that said that the General Assembly enacts this law to encourage effective intervention by the criminal justice system to hold illegal drug dealers accountable for criminal conduct that results in overdose deaths. So the legislature has clearly shown their support and their legislative intent for law enforcement and prosecutors to investigate and prosecute these cases.
You know, Scott, you've used the word several times, and I applaud this, the word poison. We think of drugs, unfortunately, in the forms, and by the way, Asa, don't let me forget, you've got to announce the drug drop-off this weekend as well. But you've used the word poison. Too often we equate drugs with aspirin, let alone with opioids or any other cancer drugs, for example. The term drug is sort of generic. The term poison isn't. I like that term. Asa, your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree, absolutely, and especially fentanyl. I mean, fentanyl is the worst thing any of us have ever dealt with. It's been a complete game changer, and I mean, it takes a very, very small amount of fentanyl to cause someone to overdose and to die. And fentanyl, a lot of things are measured in grams and things like that, and fentanyl is measured in micrograms or micrograins. And another thing about it is it's so when these dealers are mixing these drugs together, you know, they're not sitting there mixing all this stuff together in a centrifuge in a lab or something like that. They're mixing powder with powder, and two different people can take something out of the same package or mixture, and one little section of it has more fentanyl in it than the other, and one person can take those drugs and may not experience an overdose, and someone else can take some out of the same package or container and have an immediate overdose and immediate death. I mean, we've investigated cases just from our knowledge of looking at their communications and text messages and things like that, where we can tell that the person died immediately. You know, midway through a text, that type of thing, when they're communicating with someone and using the drugs and just falling dead. And not every overdose is like that, but many of them are. I mean, this is an extremely powerful drug, and there's other fentanyl analogs that are even more powerful than just regular fentanyl, such as carfentanil. And, I mean, this is nothing to mess with. I mean, we have people who come into contact with these drugs by accident and overdose and have to be Narcaned and taken to the hospital. Mm-hmm. I've had members of my staff that have been exposed. We had an exposure at the courthouse a couple of years ago after dealing with evidence from a criminal case when it was being put up in the evidence. And so, you know, people ask me about, drugs and things. We got Narcan. We got Narcan in the jailhouse. We got Narcan in the courthouse. We got Narcan in the schoolhouse. We got Narcan everywhere because anybody can come into contact with this stuff most any time.
I've got a text from one of our listeners. I'm going to get to this question to you in a moment, Scott. But before I do, you mentioned a moment ago you've got Narcan in the jail, and of course, you and I spoke briefly about this off air a few moments ago, Asa. And of course, the story was in the paper and was in the news. You had, I think it was 4 individuals who encountered fentanyl, I guess it was, and one of them. One of your deputies had to apply Narcan. And by the way, just because you've given me Narcan in an overdose doesn't mean that I'm all well and good. There's a possibility that the fentanyl is still circulating in my system. Am I correct?
Yes, that is correct. The fentanyl, especially depending on the dose and the level that's in a person's system, just because they're Narcan doesn't mean that they're free and clear. The Narcan will wear off, and if there's enough of that opiate in the person's system, it could cause them to go back into an overdose. So that's why it's imperative that they get to the hospital and get checked out if somebody's Narcan.
I'm going to go back to Scott's remarks at the very opening. This is a poison. This is not just a drug. And I quite frankly have said that in the past myself, Scott, but I think it's an important statement. I've got a quick note here. One of the callers says, what would you like to see the North Carolina legislature enact into law related to maximum sentences for fentanyl dealers?
Death by distribution cases are sentenced based on structured sentencing, which the criminal sentencing in North Carolina is set by the North Carolina legislature, and it depends on the offense that you're convicted of, and then what your prior record level is. So the higher the offense and the higher your prior record level is, the higher your sentence is going to be. And just as an example, the basic death by distribution charge in North Carolina is a Class C felony. The classes go all from A being the the most serious down to I. So this is classified as a Class C felony, and someone with no prior record level, no prior criminal record, could be sentenced anywhere from a minimum of 44 months all the way up to a maximum in the aggravated range of 123 months, which is around 10 years. Mm-hmm. So those sentences are currently in place as established by the legislature. And again, those are taken into consideration when we are working out pleas in cases or when cases are tried, and then judges hear all the evidence and then sentence accordingly based on what they're convicted of and what their prior record level is, and then the evidence in each case.
We've talked about the issue, and by the way, congratulations on your recognition by the Fentanyl Victims Network and the recognition for your success in, and I say this word success, but stopping traffickers, not just stopping the drug abusers, and we'll talk about that, but the traffickers and the work that you've done. Let's talk about the work you're also doing for those who are addicts. I'm going to start with you on this one, Scott. You and Asa have been seeking out alternatives to jail sentences, have you not?
That's correct, Lockwood. And we, from the beginning, we have said that this issue and problem requires a comprehensive approach to include education, prevention, treatment, and tough enforcement. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes people hear about the tough enforcement side of it, where we're prosecuting and sentencing drug traffickers and death by distribution cases to years in court, but they don't always pay attention to the work we're doing on the front end in education, prevention, and treatment. We had some of the first programs in the state right here in our district, which was a coordinated effort between my office, our three sheriffs, and the county detention centers, along with treatment providers. And Hope Recovery is one example there in Carteret County, where if you have somebody who is a nonviolent drug addict type first-time offender, we have programs in place where those people can have their bonds modified, be placed on unsecured bonds, be placed on electronic monitoring, and transported directly to inpatient treatment facilities. And then they remain there for several months, and if they are successful in that treatment program, they get consideration for that in terms of how their case is handled on the back end. So we have recognized many years ago that this does require that comprehensive approach, and we've had those programs in place. The counties actually pay for a certain number of beds at Hope Recovery homes so that people can be transported directly from the jails if they qualify to get that help and to get that treatment. So there's help there available for people who want that help. I've found over the years, though, you can't force people to get the help. They have to get to the point where they want it. And we have many success stories, and you don't always hear about the success stories. You hear about the prison sentences, but we have many, many success stories that I'm proud of, that we've worked with families throughout the last almost 20 years now with people who have these addiction issues.
You know, Asa, I'm going to let you wrap it up here with about 2 minutes to go, and we've talked about this in the past, and basically the concept of tough love. You've worked with that, have you not? And actually, I recall one incident where you actually looked at the mother and said she didn't want to, but you said you need to go ahead and have her arrested. Am I remembering that story correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually had those folks come on the radio with us a few years ago. And, I mean, that, like you said, I mean, our purpose is not to just arrest people. However, sometimes that is the point that some people need in order to make a change in their life. I mean, obviously it doesn't work in every situation.
Right.
But we've had many people who come, I mean, over the past, since about 2019, we've had over 220 people who were incarcerated in this jail, have worked through the program that Scott just explained, and have gone to local recovery programs right here in our county. And a fair percentage of those people, now here again, not everybody gets into recovery and stays there. I mean, unfortunately, that's part of addiction and trying to get to recovery. Sometimes people backslide, they fall off the wagon to get back on. And but we've got a pretty good percentage of people who have remained clean since 2019 up to the present, when we've kind of really officially kind of formalized our program and working with our local recovery services. And like Scott said, I mean, our county commissioners actually fund the portion of some of these beds. It seems to us it's better money spent to pay for someone to be in recovery instead of just sitting in a county jail waiting for an overcrowded county jail, waiting for their court date and not receiving any services.
Well, and also it's hopefully taking them away from a recidivism. They won't show back up, and I think that's a pretty important issue. And as you all are, as we're wrapping up, recognition by the Fentanyl Victims Network, I also have to say to you, I think that not only the victims of fentanyl overdose, but also those that could potentially be victims. You all have, and I brag on you, Scott, and Asa. Again, we have with us District Attorney Scott Thomas and Carteret County Sheriff Asa Buck. Your recognition by the Fentanyl Victims Network, frankly, is important, but also I think the recognition of those that you have actually helped save is equally important. I want to thank both of you for your time today and also congratulate you and congratulate all of those who have been supporting you on this. Again, our thanks to Scott Thomas and Asa Buck.